So I saw that too. I don't think it makes sense. I don't understand how he'll be able to cover the material. So I think
Yeah.
it has to be you and myself covering it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, I would really like to talk to Sean.
Do you want to can you turn me
I've
on
been trying to
so I
get a
can join
hold of
them?
him, but
Or
I
plug them
believe
in?
he's
Because they're
busy.
having a
But
preparatory
hopefully he
conversation
can join at
about me.
least 5 minutes before. Um,
so and the other big thing that Anna was going to do was feed me the Q&A. So someone else has
David,
to
so they
do
can hear me.
that,
so there
right?
are two
Because
things that
Can
will
you plug me
change.
in so they
Yeah,
can hear me?
well, three. First, Anna is not here anymore,
Can
so
you hear
we'll
me,
need to
Ujala?
just sort it out ourselves.
yeah.
Perhaps I think that
No.
we can go. I've noticed that in the previous sessions there haven't been that many questions. So
Okay.
if you can scroll down the questions and take one that you deem pertinent to share with the audience, that'll be fine.
Okay.
The polling questions,
No
do not
video?
work.
Okay.
Oh,
They don't
sorry.
work? Did you publish them?
Can you hear me, Ujala? Can you hear me,
Sorry,
Abraham?
Abraham, how come they don't work?
No, they can't hear me yet.
I
There's
mean, they're
Can you hear
Leticia,
me?
yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry. It's just that it seems that they can hear us. Just a second.
Can you hear me, Ujala?
Oh, where?
Oh, they can't hear me.
So just gonna look at the polling sections.
Can you
Should
hear me,
work.
Ujala? Can you hear me? Can
Yes,
you?
we hear you now.
Oh, thank God. Do you know how bad it is not to be heard? Honestly. Especially for someone like me, it's really hard.
Yeah.
and Abraham to present a fabulous workshop for you on resilience bonds. Please say who you are, Ujala and Abraham. Over to you. And then I will say a few words to get us going.
Thank you very much, Sean. Well, first of all, I wanted to welcome everyone to this training session on Greenbones for climate resilience. We thank you sincerely for being here and for being part of the 2020 Climate Bonds Initiative conference, which is one of the most important events of our organization, and which we hope has so far been helpful and valuable for all of you. Please remember that the annual conference has just started, and we still have many more interesting sessions to come throughout the rest of the week. Perhaps if we can move to the next slide. Of course, we need to recognize the amazing support of our sponsors and partners. Without them, none of this would be possible. Thank you to all of them for their incredible support. JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, Moody's, ESG Solutions, Citi, Ping An, the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, Refinement, FSD Africa, and many more. We truly appreciate the support you all provide for the successful organization of our annual conference. Next slide, please. But just before kickstarting our training session, I would just like to provide some housekeeping instructions for a smooth delivery. We have been informed that some participants are experiencing some issues with the platform, and it seems that this can be easily solved by utilizing a different browser. So if you experience any issue, we suggest using Chrome or Firefox. And if the problem still persists, please try checking your firewalls. We would also like to suggest having the access link to this session at hand, just in case of connection loss. So should that happen, please try reconnecting through that same link or just by refreshing your screen. Please be informed that the platform has a chat box where you can raise all of your questions. There is a live discussion button at the bottom, at the lower right corner of your screen. So click there and use the questions section to ask your questions at any time. And we will try to respond as many as possible during the time that we have allocated for this purpose at the end of each section. Live interpretation is available into certain languages. And finally, we would also like to inform you that this session is being recorded and it will be available on this app on SwapCard until, if I recall correctly, the month of November. Next slide, please. Good. Well, my name is Abraham Pedrosa. I'm the lead trainer at the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm here with my colleagues, Ujala Kadir, who is the head of program design. And we also have the special participation of two distinguished guests, our CBI CEO and co-founder, Sean Kidney, who will be sharing with us very important messages to kickstart the session just in a moment. And also our guest speaker, Dr. Craig Davies, who is the Associate Director of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and who leads EBRD's investment operations in the area of climate resilience. And he will be sharing with us his experience in this field later in the session. Unfortunately, our colleague Anna Creed had a last personal last-minute personal issue, and she will not be able to be here with us today, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Well, we would also just like to kindly remind you that the content of this training and its material is confidential and intended for this and only this training session. And we invite you to have a look at the disclaimer and contact CBI for any further data protection queries if there are any. Good. So just before going through our agenda, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Sean Kidney, for some welcoming statements and also to help us start setting the context for this session. Sean, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. I note that Ujala very cleverly got out of doing an introduction so she get herself a cup of coffee then. So I'm just going to say a few remarks by context until she rejoins us about it. Look, I think if you're on this call, you know the reasons why we're doing this. You know what the challenges are. Certainly people like Craig Davies do. We have a pretty big problem. We've got a climate change challenge, which involves us, well, beginning to experience climate change. While we've finally got the world's major economies committing to reasonably adequate 2030 targets. In Europe, 55% cut in emissions by 2030. Reasonably adequate because I think we're going to have to do even better because of the state of the way the world is at the moment. The mitigation agenda is huge. We've also got a resilience problem. The truth is, this year and last year, I think we've become very aware that the change has begun. We can no longer have the option of talking about how we could stop the change because it's too late. Climate change is beginning to impact, and it's going to impact severely. What we're experiencing this year in weather incidents around the world, floods, heat instances, snow in Brazil, unbelievable wildfires in Siberia, and I'm not talking about California, I'm not talking about Turkey, I'm talking about Siberia. This is the beginning. The pandemic is the beginning. It came about because of collapsed biodiversity, because we had messed up our environment so bad that we saw diseases jumping between species and infecting us. By the way, this is a feature of climate change. Whenever we've seen periods of significant climate change in the history of humanity, we've seen plagues come through. Medieval times, the 1600s, even the fall of the Roman Empire now, we understand, was plagued by plagues and climate instances. But we are going in to a humdinger of a climate incident. When we last saw major climate change in the 1600s, thanks to killing off so many Amerindians in the 1500s through smallpox and measles, we lost, we think, somewhere between 90 and 95% of all Indigenous Americans died in the last 100 years. We saw carbon regrowth in the Amazon, now very clear from research Stanford University has done. So huge that it actually cooled the world atmosphere, reduced carbon levels, and we saw 2 degrees cooling in the 1600s with feedback loops of various sorts. I can go into the detail. But there's a fantastic book by Geoffrey Parker of Cambridge, which is about the global climate crisis of the 1600s. Given what we're going through, it makes for terrifying reading. When we saw 2 degrees cooling, we, in that century, saw famine, plague, war. We lost a third of the world's population. They died, in other words, of famine, plague and war. Yes, that's right. Only a few hundred years ago, climate incidents led to a loss of a third of the world's population. We're now looking at temperature increases that could be in the 6 to 8 degrees above a median that we've had before. It's already around 1.2 degrees. Now we're on a fight to try and reduce it to make sure it doesn't get beyond, well, 1.5 is our target, which means it will go to 2 and we may be able to claw it back with a lot of direct air capture and various other measures. we have a chance. We have a fighting chance. Climate scientists around the world tell me that we are still in the era of human-induced climate change. It has not yet become an era of runaway climate change with various Earth systems doing their thing and we lose the opportunity to change things. Really, we've got till about 2030, not 2050. And this is why those 2030 targets are so critical. But we also have to understand that the climate will change at least as much as 2 degrees in this century, similar to the 1600s. That's going to lead to some changes. It is leading to some changes. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has a health committee. That health committee has been predicting pandemics as a feature of climate change for the last 30 years. We've had a few goes at it, SARS, MERS, and we then had a bit of a brutal one last year. Brutal. People died, a lot of people died, a lot more than the original figures, the official figures are showing us. And yet we were lucky because the mortality rate was about 1%, is about 1%. SARS, a different potential pandemic that we nipped in the bud at the time, has a mortality rate of 20%, mainly affecting 30 to 40-year-olds. That would have been a very different pandemic. We have to assume it's going to hit us again and again. We have to assume that wildfires are going to hit us again and again. We have to assume that extreme heat, as we saw in the Pacific Northwest, the heat dome last month, 49.9 Celsius temperatures in British Columbia is not normal, let alone across the whole Northwest. And that's been repeated in various parts of the world. We have to assume these things are going to happen. We have to plan and work and prepare for this change. So while we get the idea of mitigation, we're beginning to get it. I'm sorry, we don't really get it. We're still making stupid decisions about building new fossil fuel plants all around the world, which are utterly opposed to what we have to do. Madness. So we don't fully get it yet, but we're getting there. We now have to accept that the next 30 years is going to be rough. The next 80 years is going to be rough. I would have probably dropped off my perch before it gets really bad, but probably not, because understand the latency issues in global climate systems. The emissions that we put in 1990 are affecting the world today. In other words, it takes about 30 years to wash through the impact. In the last 30 years, we've put in more emission to the atmosphere than the previous 150 years. That guarantees the next 30 years, even if we cut emissions stone cold dead tomorrow morning, will continue to be worse and worse and worse in terms of climatic instances. We have to take measures to protect the poor. We've learned from the pandemic, if you let janitors, cleaners, manufacturing workers, people on low incomes keep on working because they have to, because there's no social protection, there's no free health for them, the disease will spread and everyone will suffer. And the whole economy will suffer. We've learned a bitter lesson about how we need to manage our economies in the last year. That has to be applied to all areas of work. We need to be preparing our coastal defences. There will be floods, they will be ugly. There will be floods as we experienced in Germany a few weeks ago, and there will be coastal floods. Already, the delta in the Mekong in Vietnam, the rice bowl of Southeast Asia, is seeing salination for 100 kilometres up from the coast. People cannot grow rice in salty water, or at least we don't know how to yet. We've got to start preparing for that and understand, we're going to get tidal surges right up the Mekong Delta and every low-lying area around the world. That's coastal protection measures, which may be planting a lot of mangroves, which we have so outrageously cut down over the last 100 years, the last 30 years, really. It may be, in some places, building seawalls. It may be, in other places, relocating whole populations if we can. Bangladesh, that has so many people living in highly exposed areas to tidal surges, has a bit of difficulty relocating people, especially as India has built razor wire walls on the border with Bangladesh. There's not a lot of places to go in a crisis. We've got to prepare for these. We've got to negotiate agreements between countries to allow people to move. We have to beef up our international institutions. We need a World Health Organization that has 3 times the budget. Not arguing about whether it should have any budget at all, let alone a UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees. We are going to see a lot of refugees. We need a much bigger budget for all of that. That is a given. Yes, we're on a race to stop catastrophic climate change. If we can stop emissions quickly, we have a chance of stabilising the world's climate and having a reasonable adaptation process in the second half of this century. Let's assume we succeed. Let's assume in the meantime we prepare for crisis. And the crisis will involve public sector bodies, governments, having to spend a lot more on emergencies like Hurricane Ida that's just gone through the US. Teensy one. In Taiwan, typhoons are expected to be 3 times as intense as they currently are. And you've already seen one of those high-rises in Taipei shaking in a typhoon with the pool on the 37th floor, the water sloshing around. Be terrified of what 3 times the intensity looks like. That's going to happen. How do we prepare? How do we change our building codes to make sure that building in Taipei is stronger? Are we ready for that? We've done it with earthquakes. We can do it with typhoons if we get our act together. How do we prepare our agricultural sectors for radically changed weather patterns? We will no longer have snow melt feeding the rivers of Pakistan and India. We will need different water infrastructure to be able to capture water when it falls as rain, no longer as snow melt or snow and then held back to go for the whole season. It'll come in a dump. We have to capture it so people will continue to be able to drink and eat despite the drastic changes in the climate. There's so much to be done, but I want to leave you with a thought about heat. Our cities are going to get a lot hotter. We need to reduce the heat. There's lots of infrastructure issues. We've got to stop putting air conditioning whacked onto the side and build, design for more efficiency. And we've got to plant trees. You plant trees in a city street, the temperature drops 5 degrees. This is going to become, in the next few years, a matter of life and death. There's so much to be done. But I've got a bit of good news. Just a little bit, just a tingle. After that rather depressing, it is depressing, perspective. There's a lot of capital required to be deployed. Between mitigation and resilience, about $90 to $100 trillion in the next 30 years. US dollars, by the way. Quite big dollars. We've managed to show that the capital is there. It's floating around in negative interest rate Japanese bonds, German bonds, Swiss bonds, Swedish bonds. Interest rates are unbelievably low historically. If ever you wanted to rebuild the world's economy, it's the perfect time. That capital needs to be deployed to pay your pension or my pension to areas that can get a bit of yield. And that's going to be solutions to climate change, infrastructure and the like. So we've got the capital. We've proven with the green and sustainable bonds market that if we construct investments that people can invest in, that institutional investors can invest in, they will invest. This is a market that is close to $2 trillion US in size already. Granted, it's got to be 50 trillion. We've got a way to go. But it grew 80% this year. While the seas are rising, the green bond market is rising faster. That gives me hope. And of course, resilience bonds can be used by sovereigns, major corporations, banks, to finance investments in preparing our societies. Physical resilience, social resilience, health system resilience. In fact, if you go through the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they're a marker of the areas we have to invest in. We have the capital. We need to construct the opportunities for people to invest. We can do this as an extension of the $2 trillion green and sustainable bond market, or soon to be, or as it is. We've already seen this. We've seen water bonds from Cape Town. We've seen the Netherlands government issue a certified climate bond for coastal protection measures, for resilience measures on the coast. We've had a few little inklings. Some of the development banks, like the World Bank, have included resilience projects in their green bonds. So far, so good. We can do a lot more. In the next few years, this underinvested sector, this ignored sector, this sector involved in preparing for the future, given we know what the future is going to look like, needs to be developed rapidly, quickly, or else we're going to lose a lot of people. And we can't afford to, we don't want to. And frankly, for the people who are left, if we lose a lot of people, you get imploded states. If we lose a lot of people, you get war, you get mass migration. The ability to keep fighting for mitigation will go out the window if we're trying to deal with hundreds of millions of people trying to cross borders to find homes and people shooting them, as they will try and shoot them. So mitigation depends on sorting out resilience. We don't sort out resilience, we will lose the mitigation fight as well. We want to see, we expect to see, we hope to see a massive growth from virtually nothing to at least 50% of the green bonds market. And let's face it, what we mean green bonds, we just mean money flowing to solutions, whatever you call it, quickly. We need to have something like $5 to $6 trillion a year going towards climate solutions, half of that to resilience. That's the job. Of course, this workshop, this session, is about discussing how you do it. But just remember, it's an extension of an existing market. Investors, issuers, like big liquid markets, it makes it easy for them to manage the due diligence. You break it up little silos, it becomes complicated. You get illiquidity issues, which means high cost. We need to take advantage of the lower cost that we're seeing in green bond markets. That is, yes, that's right. Green bonds have a lower cost of capital now compared to vanilla bonds. Proof definitive, and we'll see, if you have a look at the pricing report that's being published tomorrow, you'll see the data about that. Let's cram in resilience as an extension of that, which is what we're doing at climate bonds, and take advantage of that large, liquid, big market. What we're really doing is expanding people's understanding of what has to be done, expanding investors' understanding of what has to be done, expanding governments' understanding of what has to be done. It's not just clean energy. God knows we need clean energy, but it's not just clean energy. It's land use management, it's agriculture, it's coastal protection, it's social protection. So every time we get a crazy, mad climate incident, we can rebuild quickly and get people back to work and make sure they can get health care and jobs so they can keep on their lives rather than have to try and find another home. That's why resilience is so important. But I think we're going to do it. We just got to do more workshops like this. So that's why I have hope. Capital's there, everyone. Remember, investors are there. Ujala, I think it's time for you.
Thank you so much, Sean, for providing that context and for getting us started. I think some dire warnings and words about the state of the situation and the state of resilience, but also a lot of opportunity and hope ahead. So thank you for setting us up with that sort of last message of hope, which is why I'm so grateful to be here today and to be talking at this session, because there's a really exciting opportunity ahead of us. And this conference is really a platform to really discuss those positive sort of directions and optimism. So thank you everyone for being here. Before I dive in, sorry, I just want to make sure my slides are there because I don't see them. Could we please share slides, Letitia? Thank you. And we can, Abraham, do you want to present the agenda before I jump in?
Yeah, sure, Jela.
Sure.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Sean, for such pertinent messages to begin this session, and definitely for helping us setting up the contents of the importance of resilience for a sustainable development. Well, we hope that with Sean's first insights and with the elements that we're going to be discussing throughout the session, we will also contribute to a better understanding of the linkages between the concept of resilience and particularly the role of resilience bonds and the objective of creating and maintaining, of course, our social, economic, and ecological systems. Now, to just quickly start with the content of our session, the elements that you see on your screen are the topics that we're going to be covering in the next few minutes. In the first half of the session, we're going to be providing an overview of the resilience concept. In here, my colleague Ujala will discuss the role of finance for climate adaptation and resilience. We will also have a closer look at the climate resilience principles and also at some additional work that the Climate Bonds Initiative has carried out to catalyze resilience investments. After those initial elements, we will also provide an overview of the evolution of the sustainable debt market in the past decade. And we will particularly analyze the growth of green bonds for climate resilience. And we will end up the first section with some actions that can help boost the uptake and impact of green bonds for climate resilience. After having set up the scene, we will then delve into the process of issuing a green bond for climate resilience. And in here, we're going to talk about the elements that we should have in mind at the pre-issuance, issuance, and post-issuance phases. And to finalize our session, as I said at the beginning, we will have the special participation of a guest speaker that's going to be sharing with us his experience with resilience bonds. So with this rather comprehensive and also interesting agenda, we expect that by the end of this session, you'll have a clear idea of what resilience bonds are, what type of projects and assets can be funded through these thematic bonds. And we also hope that by the end you have a solid understanding of the process to issue these instruments. Well, that's the agenda that we have for today. I'll stop here. Ujala, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Abraham. So if we could advance to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So I want to just start off with an apology. It's always a good way to start a presentation. And the apology is that there are some wordy slides ahead, but fear not, I will not read to all the details or present all the materials in those slides, but will rather give you some of the key takeaways and hopefully bring out some of the really important points from each slide. And you will have the slides afterwards for reference and to read at your own time in your own leisure. So let's get started. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is climate resilience? We hear a lot of these terms, people in this sector, in this space, we use climate adaptation, climate resilience, climate vulnerability, climate risk. These are all commonly used terms that experts use. Sometimes they're very hotly debated, and sometimes for good reason. But for the purposes of today's conversation and for the resilience bonds, we are trying to lay it out rather simply as context for this session. So in the most simplest of terms, climate adaptation is what we do. It's the actions we take to achieve a condition. And the condition that we're discussing is resilience. So adaptation is actions, resilience is where we want to get to. So we'll use these two concepts quite interchangeably, so you don't need to worry too much. When we say adaptation or resilience, we're kind of in this context speaking about two of the same things. So in the most important distinction, and rather, I think more important distinction for today's conversation and for green bonds in general, is around the asset level and system levels distinction. So this distinction, unsurprisingly, is also not as clear-cut as we would hope, but in simple terms, we can frame it in terms of intention. So when the intention of an investment or a resilience investment is to improve an asset or an activity so that it can withstand climate impacts, that's what we call asset level resilience. For example, improving ventilation of a building, adding green roofs to a building, stormwater drainage to an asset. So these kind of asset-specific activities that help that asset to be functional throughout its lifetime is what we would call asset-level resilience. On the other hand is systems-level resilience. And here, there's an explicit intention by the project proponent or the issuer to deliver climate resilience benefits to a broader system. And that system can be infrastructure, it can be communities, it can be cities. So an example would be constructing levees or dikes, investing in wetlands to protect coastal areas. So there you're protecting an entire system of people, infrastructure, and communities around that area. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. But this is a basic distinction that it appears in many different guidelines that you'll see. So in order to issue a resilience bond, you will likely need to understand these kind of distinctions. Slide 2, please. Next slide. Great, thank you. So as many of you may know, CBI's mission is to mobilize capital for low carbon and resilient investments. And as Sean spoke to earlier, the market has been very much focused on mitigation and on low carbon investments on the energy sector. And so the low carbon side of the equation has really taken front and center spot in the market, but it's become abundantly clear, as again, Sean really laid out well for us, that we can't ignore adaptation. It has to be simultaneously addressed. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the work CBI does around resilience and adaptation. So this includes the climate resilience principles. It includes work we've done to input into the EU taxonomy. And then we've also recently produced a couple of reports to help promote the green bond market in becoming more responsive to adaptation needs. And then finally, we are planning a flagship project on resilience that we will launch next year. And this will include a number of different strategic areas of work, including market development for green bonds for resilience, standards, developing more granular standards and guidelines, as well as engaging investors around the awareness on resilience and risk and how they can invest in a more credible way around resilience assets. So next slide, please. So the climate resilience principles, we published these in 2019 in a partnership with the World Resources Institute and Climate Resilience Consulting, as well as an expert group, which included 30 specialists in this area. So this was a first of its kind for the market. And we'll hear a little bit more about that today from our guest speaker, Craig Davies, who issued from the EBRD, who issued their first resilience bond, actually using our principles. So really looking forward to hearing more about how it was applied and that experience. Next slide, please. You can skip to the next one. Thank you. So around the same time that we were developing the resilience principles, the EU taxonomy was also being developed, is particularly the adaptation part of the taxonomy. So this was great timing because this meant that we were able to really harmonize our work and the work of the EU taxonomy. We had experts from our group also participating and inputting into the EU taxonomy adaptation working group and vice versa. So what that means is we now have more than one guidance, we have multiple guidance, including EU taxonomy, and we'll talk more about others. And as you can see from this diagram here, that they've also used a somewhat similar distinction between the types of investments that count as adaptation investments that you can include in a bond or in other financial structures. The only difference is we call it asset level and system level, and they call it adaptation of and adaptation by. But very similar in nature, both of these concepts. So we hope that this and the principles, the EU taxonomy, and all the other important guidelines coming up are going to really help grow this market and grow awareness around how to actually identify credible investments. Next slide, please. So on the publications that I mentioned before, so we worked with the Global Center on Adaptation with support from EBRD to produce two publications aimed at catalyzing more green bond issuance in the market. So really excited to actually launch. These have been launched today. Well, the summaries, the executive summaries have, so please feel free to read those. They will provide some links on the conference website. So these, the full reports will be published later this month, but you can at least get a taster for what they include. And today's training is actually really based on these two reports. And so we'll be getting into some of the details of both of these, more so on the issuer's guides of those two. Next slide, please. So this is there's a lot of information here, so please do, when you have time, take a look. But I'd like to just spend a few minutes sharing some of the specific and notable findings of these reports. So overall, the green bond market, I'm going to start with just a quick background, although I think Sean's given a little bit of a sense of the kind of growth we've seen. But overall, the green bond market has grown significantly since the inception of the market. And today it stands at over $1.3 trillion issued to date. And you can see from that chart on the top in the left-hand corner that in 2020, we saw a surge of other types of labeled instruments in addition to green bonds, especially social bonds and pandemic bonds, COVID bonds. So this is actually a really encouraging and exciting sign for resilience, because adaptation and resilience really does lie at the heart of achieving any and all sustainable development goals, including social and health outcomes. So I think it will be very critical for resilience to be really framed in this way, where it's not, obviously it's climate resilience to climate impacts, but also understanding how climate intersects and interacts with other goals, such as social goals. So seeing this kind of rise in investor demand for these kind of thematic labels is a really encouraging sign for the resilience bond market itself. However, we do know that only 16% of the green bond market to date has actually included adaptation and resilience. And this is concerning, but not surprising. So our study and our paper that we produced, we did a deep dive analysis into the green bond frameworks of most green bonds issued to date using our Climate Bond Initiative Green Bond database. So yes, the results were that it's a bit more than what we had expected. I think a few years ago, we had analyzed around 5 to 6%. So we were able to go deeper into the analysis. And I think what's important to note here is that 79% of those issuances came from developed markets and only 6% actually came from emerging economies. And this really needs to change. This is concerning, particularly given the very high vulnerability of emerging economies to climate impacts. Not to say that in developed markets, there will not be climate impacts, but the vulnerability, the ability to actually respond to those impacts is much lower in the emerging economies. And this needs to change. With respect to issuers, 12% were issued by sovereigns and local governments, and 65% by government-backed entities, 16% by development banks, and only 4% by financial corporates and only 3% by companies themselves. Again, this really needs to change, because while sovereign and sub-sovereign issuance and debt for resilience will likely to continue and is incredibly important and part of the mandate of the public sector, we do need private sector finance in this space if we really want to meet the trillions and trillions of dollars needed over the next decade to meet the investment gap for adaptation. So finally, the last point I'd like to just note quickly is that a lot of the projects, most of the projects, the majority of them in fact, were related to water and water infrastructure and water-related projects. So this is great, because we do need resilience building in the water sector, but we do expect and hope to see greater diversity of sectors in which we see resilience-focused bonds as awareness and capacity grows, but really as more guidance and more standards and metrics grow, because those really help to unlock and help to identify what the right kind of investments could be. And we'll talk more about that a bit later. Next slide, please. So the opportunity ahead, did we skip a slide? Could you go back one? Okay, nope. No worries. So here are some examples of green bonds for climate resilience. So when we say green bonds for climate resilience, again, just to reemphasize, these are basically just green bonds that happen to have resilience-focused investments included in their use of proceeds. And some of them are mixed. Most of them, in fact, are mixed mitigation and adaptation. So it's uncommon to find ones that are fully focused on resilience, though there are some, as Craig will later talk about his bond. So many have already paved the way. There's many lessons to be learned from the various examples. Here are just a snapshot of a few. Our report, if you do have a chance to read them, has much more detail and information around some of these that hopefully will add some value in bringing to the market some more lessons that we can learn. So just quickly, Fiji, we have a bond from Fiji. They issued a sovereign bond, which was an excellent, it really focused on building resilience in highly vulnerable coastal areas. And it really did cover a range of sectors, from agriculture to health to education. So great to see that coverage. In Norway, we have a great example from KBN. So KBN, there is a Norwegian pronunciation for that, which I will not attempt. So I've used the shorthand. It's a local government funding agency, and they issued a bond in 2019, and it includes a range of mitigation and adaptation measures as well. I think some of the really interesting stuff in there that I hadn't seen in other bonds was a focus on early warning systems. So they installed sirens and other sort of infrastructure to support their early warning system around landslides and tsunamis. They used the bond to fund reinforcing of water infrastructure to withstand increased rainfall, and a host of other examples that were really focused on reducing vulnerability and addressing climate risk. In Mexico, a really great example, I love this one, it's one of my personal favorites. It's from FIRA. It's a national development bank that used their green bond, to finance and refinance hundreds of loans within its portfolio. So this was a really good example of seeing aggregation, because they used their existing loan portfolio, and they found they identified loans that were used for supporting sustainable agriculture and irrigation to withstand drought conditions in the future that are expected. So there are many more examples in the report, lots of rich detail, and I'll leave it there for you to hopefully read more. And of course, happy to follow up on some of these if you're interested to learn more. Next slide, please. So I am missing a slide, but that's okay, because I'm just really quickly speak to it. So I think it was really important, and it was really more just around the opportunity that we have. And I know we've talked about this, but the opportunity to unlock finance at scale for adaptation it's really exciting. And I think what's exciting about this is, well, let me step back for a second. So when we first started developing these reports, we put together an expert group that has helped us immensely in developing these reports. And this expert group, one of the members one day was said something that really struck me. And he said, it's so sad that adaptation and resilience has always been the poorer cousin of mitigation. And I thought, yeah, that's harsh, but incredibly true. And I know that there are no silver bullets, and we're not saying that green bonds for resilience is a silver bullet. However, there's an opportunity to take advantage of an existing instrument, which already allows for the inclusion of adaptation. We can use existing tools and guidance, and we can build on existing market momentum. We can galvanize already growing investor demand and awareness to deal with climate risks, to deal with the impacts of climate change. So yeah, I think there's so much potential for us to grow this and to really improve the private sector flows of capital towards resilience. So on that, there are some key priority areas that we believe can really help to unlock this market and to grow this market. And fundamental and absolutely urgent is to build the momentum that we already have, the momentum that I've just mentioned, by raising awareness and building capacity amongst all stakeholders, particularly issuers, on how to identify resilience assets to be included in green bond frameworks. Building capacity of multilateral development banks, civil society, investors. These are all absolutely critical because the level of capacity and awareness around resilience remains to be low, which is one of the main findings of our analysis and study and speaking to many, many different people in this space. Secondly, we need to ensure that the market grows credibly, in a credible way so that growth can be sustained, so that confidence in the label remains, that investors can really feel sure that when a bond is relabeled a green bond and it includes resilience assets, that it truly does reduce climate risk. And finally, and perhaps the most challenging, is that we need to scale up through policy and regulatory changes. And this can range from a number of and a variety of different actions. But in addition to, I think, the move already for mandatory climate risk disclosure, well, a move from voluntary to hopefully some more mandatory risk disclosure, requiring companies to report on the risk and as well as how they will address risk and reduce risk. Incentives that lower the cost of capital for climate resilience. Those are also key strategies, policies that help to lower the cost of capital. So these are just some of the key areas that we believe will really help in moving us forward. We provide more analysis around this and details around some of these specific recommendations in the report. So please do take a look. And I will stop there. Thank you for your time. And I really look forward to hearing some of your questions now. So I'm just going to take a look at some of the questions in the Q&A. Okay, so I see, sorry, I just need to switch to my other screen just briefly. And I also note that, sorry, before I answer questions, we have put a poll up in the app, the Swap Card app, and I've noticed that some people have responded to some of these. So I just want to quickly look at those because the results are interesting. So one of the first questions on the poll was, what are the key barriers to private investment in climate resilience? And we had provided several options as well as in others. And I see that 38% voted for insufficient incentives for financial actors to invest in the adaptation and resilience. So again, yeah, totally what we found in the market as well, that the incentive structures for including resilience are not as where they need to be. Absence of robust and harmonized standards and metrics, absolutely. This is a key area, and I think some of the work that we've been doing and that the EU taxonomy is doing is really going to help in addressing that, but there's a lot to be done in having more granular standards. And then I see 11% complexity of quantifying the benefits of adaptation investments. So this is a really, I think, a key area that many in this sector, I think, discuss to great detail is the results or the benefits of adaptation can often be quite diffuse, and they can often be far into the future. Also, when you invest in resilience, the impacts and the benefits accrue across the board to different systems, to different communities. And so capturing those and having tools to capture those can often be quite challenging. And then the other poll, I'll just quickly read that. What are the key triggers for unlocking investments in climate resilience? So let's see what people had to say. Looks like a lot of the various recommendations are resonating with people. Looks like 23%, so that's the highest one, is on policy and regulatory measures that incentivize resilience investments. So government action. Creating greater awareness on climate risks and benefits of investing in resilience. Yep. Yeah, this is very much in line with what I think we've been hearing in the market so far. And so please feel free to continue looking at that poll if you haven't yet. And we will leave this poll up for the next few days. So even people who haven't attended this session, or if you want to come back and see what people have voted, you're welcome to do so. So back to the questions, just taking a look. So first question, what strategies will be taken at the level of decision makers about policies and incentives to further promote green bonds and make them sustainable? So this is a great question. I think there's several, obviously there's many options of what we can do, but I think some of the low-hanging fruits that we've heard from many of the people we've spoken to are, number one, really being able to develop pipelines of projects. I think currently where there are green bonds being issued, often one of the challenges is that there are simply not enough projects in the pipeline. And sometimes this is due, so there's many reasons for this, but often this is due to a lack of screening criteria or the ability to look through portfolios, look through budgets, and identify which assets are actually credibly contributing to resilience. So one of the key strategies for this, particularly in emerging economies that we think could be successful, is the further refinement of the national adaptation plans, the NAPs, because the NAPs really bring together various ministries. They bring together, the different sectoral needs under one umbrella, which is focused on climate adaptation. And it really allows for a coordinated development of a pipeline of projects. So I think that's one key area. Another key area where decision makers and policymakers can be very impactful is, as we mentioned, putting in place policies and regulatory incentives. So can we incentivize, can there be tax breaks, can there be subsidies, can there be preferential treatment of different sorts for bonds or for investments? It doesn't even have to be for bonds, for investments in resilience. If you can prove and demonstrate that you've significantly reduced climate risk, there are XYZ benefits that help you to access lower cost capital. So that's another key area. And then I think finally, another important aspect is related again to standards and harmonization and benchmarking. So we've noted that in the green bond market itself, mitigation and adaptation assets and investments have really grown on the back of clear identified metrics, standards, and benchmarks. And we need something similar, and we need those often at country levels, because one thing about resilience and adaptation is it's significantly more complicated than mitigation. Mitigation, it doesn't matter if you're in Pakistan or India, or if you're in the US, you can still account for the carbon that you're emitting. Whereas adaptation and resilience is incredibly location specific, context specific. And so local guidelines, local criteria and benchmarks are critical for being able to identify. However, it's really important that these local guidelines and local criteria are harmonized with existing global architecture around this. And the reason for that is because a lot of the investors that you would want to attract when issuing a resilience bond will be investors that do have to report against, for example, the EU taxonomy. So having that harmonization, if we want to see unimpeded flows of capital, is really, really important. So I'll stop there on that. And just take a look at the other questions. And Abraham, please stop me if I'm running out of time, and we can always pick up again later. But I'll try to answer one more. Let me just take a look. Okay, this is a good one. And we will also talk much more detail about this when we get into the steps. But the question is, when issuing a climate resilience bond, is it part of the process to provide models and projections about possible effects of climate impacts in the cash flows and profitability of the economic activity as part of the rationality or justification of the project? So the answer to this is yes and no. So yes, if without being able to identify the actual risk assessment, without being able to carry out a risk assessment, you will not be able to identify how your project or your asset or your activity reduces that risk. So it is important to include that in the process of identifying your resilience bond. However, it is not at all necessary that each issuer or each project proponent does this themselves. There are many existing resources. It really depends on the project and how large or small it is and what the existing climate projections and scenarios for that region are. But often there will be climate projections that are granular enough for your locality, produced by your government or by other institutions, and those can be used to identify what the climate risks and impacts are. In terms of cash flows and in terms of the financial impact of those risks, that is not required as part of the green bond issuance process. It clearly would be something that would be considered when developing the project itself. And for this is why we really believe that in order to grow the resilience bond market, we actually need more technical assistance and support on developing financial models and investment models for these kind of projects. And there's a real need for blended finance, for technical assistance to really support the project development phase. But for the green bond itself, that is not a requirement. So I'll stop there, Abraham. I think I will, I can always come back and answer more questions later in the session, but we can perhaps move on to the next section. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ujala. And thanks everyone for all of your very pertinent questions. Please keep on putting them in the chat box. Now we're gonna move to the next section of our presentation. As advanced to you earlier, this second module, the second section of our training focuses on the process now for issuing a bond for climate resilience. If we can move to the next slide, please. So to kickstart this session, what you see on your screen now are the main supplementary or additional steps to follow when issuing a green bond for climate resilience. However, and very important to highlight here is that from a financial perspective, the process of issuing a green bond for climate resilience or any other thematic bond for that matter is the same as that of issuing a traditional bond, a vanilla bond, as they are usually referred to. However, in this case, the label that is being attributed to the bond translates into some additional steps that, in this case, the issuer needs to take into consideration throughout the entire process. So steps 1 to 5 are to be undertaken at the pre-issuance phase. Then we have the issuance phase in step number 6. And finally, at post-issuance, we have step number 7 regarding post-issuance reporting practices. And well, we will now see each of these steps in detail in the following slides. Next slide, please. So as a first step in the process, the issuer is advised to select the guidance that will govern the bond. Okay, this guidance will help the issuer in selecting eligible projects. It will support them in establishing appropriate mechanisms for tracking and allocation of proceeds. It will provide guidance on external review methodologies and also on reporting practices, among other elements. Currently, the market infrastructure, we can say that it's still dominated by voluntary approaches, but as the market evolves, we've seen more mandatory approaches emerging. So here, as an example, we have different guidances that exist in the market. For instance, here we have the Greenbone principles that have been vastly covered in other previous sessions today. These principles were produced by the International Capital Market Association. These are voluntary principles that they have produced, and basically we can say that these are recommendations or qualities that ICMA has found important for stakeholders to adopt and also to evaluate in their issuance processes. And what these principles provide is basically guidance on key components involved in launching a credible label bond. These principles are composed of 4 components. The first component, or the first pillar, is the use of proceeds component, which basically refers to the utilization of the proceeds of the bonds for green projects. Then the second pillar of these principles is the process for project evaluation and selection. And this basically refers to the process by which the issuer determines how the projects fit within the eligible categories that were identified by ICMA. The third pillar of these principles is the management of proceeds. And this basically refers to carefully tracking the bond proceeds from the moment the label bond is issued until the funds are reconciled against the expenditures of the eligible green projects or assets. Then the fourth component of these principles is the reporting pillar, which basically refers to being able to make and keep readily available up-to-date information on the use of proceeds. ICMA, this organization, has also produced other similar guidelines. We can go back to the previous slide, please. Has also produced other similar guidelines and approaches for other label bonds, such as social bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, and among others. There's also another very pertinent example to mention here, which is the Klamath Bonds Initiative Standard and the Certification Scheme, for which we have a very interesting session just prior to this one. CBI has also produced the resilience principles, and that my colleague Ujala has already spoke about. And well, there's other guidance out there, which includes, for instance, the EU Greenbone standards, the ASEAN standards in Asia, the Greenbone catalog that was produced by the People's Bank of China or the Central Bank of China, among others. But what is important here perhaps to highlight is that in order to determine which guidance to follow, issuers need to consider three aspects. So the first one is the jurisdiction in which they operate and where they are issuing, and also the jurisdiction of their targeted investors, and also the degree of detail that is sought in the guidance. Next slide, please. Now, as you might know, and as we have explained before, the main difference between a plain vanilla bond or a conventional bond and a green bond is that for green issuances, the proceeds are allocated to projects and assets that are considered green, right? And in this sense, as a second step in the process, the issuer must identify the projects and the assets that are eligible for inclusion in the bond. For this purpose, there are very suitable tools in the market that can provide guidance on this regard. For instance, the Klamath bonds initiative taxonomy that has been mentioned in previous sessions, pardon me, provides a list of projects and assets that are green, that is, projects and assets that are in line with the Paris Agreement and also a low carbon economy. In addition to that, the Climate Resilience Principles publication that was shown in a previous slide also provides a list of illustrative examples of investments that can contribute to climate resilience, and a few examples of that are included in that document are illustrated in this slide. So in this second step, what is important is for the issuer to decide which categories of green they wish to align with. But the key point of this step, if I may say, is that the selection process is as transparent as possible in order to provide investors with comfort that the issuer's internal processes are robust and that the projects being nominated are fully eligible. Next slide, please. The next step in the pre-issuance phase of a bond in the issuance process of the green bond is the preparation of the Greenbone framework. The Greenbone framework is simply a document that requests information on how the issuer internal processes align with the green bond eligibility criteria. One part of this document, one part of this green bond framework focuses on the processes that are to be implemented at the pre-issuance phase, namely the use of proceeds, the selection of projects and assets, the management of proceeds, and also the external review, which you might recall from the previous slide are basically the components of the Greenbone principles, the 4 pillars that we described before. And then other section of this document, other section of this Greenbone framework requires information about the post-issuance phase, specifically information about audit and reporting. So in very simple terms, the Greenbone framework is a physical document. It's a template that is to be completed by the issuer, and this document is generally made publicly available to the market, and it's considered by many the centerpiece of the Greenbone issuance process. And basically the boxes that you see on your screen that are indicated from A to F are the sections to be completed in the template. Next slide, please. Now, as you might have noticed from the previous slide, the last element of the Greenbone framework that I just described indicated a external review step, right? It was, if I recall correctly, indicated in the letter F. So this phase or this step basically refers to a service by an external auditor or reviewer in which this service provider assesses the green attributes of the bond. Almost all the external reviews, we can say that fall under three categories. There are the second party opinions, the SPOs, there's also assurance, and there's also certification, but there's another category, scoring or rating process, but based on some statistics that CBI has compiled, this alternative seems to be less common in the market. Now, regarding the second party opinion, based on, again, the statistics that CBI has collected, this alternative or this methodology seems to be the most popular form of external review in the Greenbone market. What this methodology does is basically providing it provides an opinion on the framework that is used for the bond, and also about the issuer's overall sustainability narrative. So this methodological approach, the second party opinions, are generally designed by the service providers, and they are generally aligned with the Greenbone principles. And one important element to mention is that usually this review is carried out at the pre-issuance phase with no follow-up after the issuance and allocation of proceeds. But we have now seen in the market that more and more second party opinions also are carried out after the issuance phase. And well, this type of reviews vary in the market. The methodology of these reviews vary in the market depending on the service providers. And there are many different service providers for SPOs. There's Sustainalytics, VGO Aries, ISS, OECOM, DNVGL, and many other service providers in the market. Then there's the assurance option, which is another type of external review methodology. This is basically an assessment of the green credentials of the bond, and also of the internal procedures that were established by the issuers. The main difference, if I may say, with the if compared to the second party opinion, is that SPOs can also provide an assessment of the sustainability, including social and sustainability credentials of a issuer's Greenbone framework, while assurance reports are usually prepared to analyze the green or the climate credentials of the issuances. There are also many providers of this methodology in the market. We have the big four consulting companies, E&Y, Deloitte, KPMG, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, and also some SPO providers such as Sustainalytics also can offer this service. Now, the other external review methodology is the scoring and rating. Although, as I said before, this is a less common practice in the current Greenbone market. This alternative basically consists of a report from a rating agency or any specialized firm, which scores the issuer's framework against an established range. And in here, rather than providing an opinion as in the second party opinions or in the assurance methodology, in here what is provided is a grade as a result of the analysis. In here we have, for instance, SP ratings, and Sustainalytics also provides these type of services. Now, the last option, which I will not spend that much time on this alternative because we have had a specific session for this one, but I will just mention it quickly here, is the certification process, which if you attended the previous session, you might recall that my colleagues mentioned that this is a formal endorsement of a bond's credentials and consistency with an accepted standard. For instance, the Climate Bonds Initiative offers a certification scheme where green debt instruments are verified basically to conform with the climate bonds standard. And this approach is seen by many as a very good practice in the market. And well, another element to mention about this is that the certification scheme already embeds the Greenbone principles in its framework, and it occurs all along the life of the bond, which means that independent assurance is required before issuance and also after issuance of the bond, and which is not the case in other methodologies. Next slide, please. Now, this next step refers basically to the mechanisms that the issuer needs to establish in order to manage and track the proceeds that are coming from the bonds internally, right? In this regard, there are two commonly used mechanisms. On one side, we have the earmarking mechanism, in which the proceeds basically enter the balance sheet of the issuer, and these proceeds are set aside for future allocation to the selected projects and assets. So in its most basic or simple sense, in here when we talk about earmarking, we're talking about flagging something, and in this case is to flag the proceeds for a specific purpose. There's another alternative called ring fencing, and this option it's when the issuer decides to separate the proceeds from its business as usual operations. And in simple terms, in here we are talking about segregating a portion of the company's financial assets from the rest. The reporting step that is mentioned here is as part of the pre-issuance phase of a bond, simply refers to establishing the reporting process that will be followed or that will occur are post-issuance. So in here, we're talking about issuers being encouraged to provide information on how they are intending to offer up-to-date information on the use of proceeds, and basically at a later stage, and also to provide information at the frequency of these reports. But we'll talk more about this in the last slide of this section. Next slide, please. Now, regarding the issuance phase, well, this phase simply refers to issuing the bond, and it starts when the bond is announced to the market and the book is open. This book basically refers to a digital archive or platform where orders from investors are noted, and the issuance operation is completed when there's a final agreement among those involved investors, issuers, banks, etc. Perhaps one element that is important to highlight about the issuance phase, about this particular step in the process, is that when launching the green bond into the market, issuers are advised to include their green or climate attributes in marketing materials with the purpose of attracting perhaps a broader range of investors. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide of this section, and it's about the reporting activity in the process, which is a very important part of the issuance process of a green bond for climate resilience. About this, we have had also a dedicated session at the beginning of the day on this regard. But in here, I will just mention some key elements regarding the reporting activity. We can first start by saying that there are different approaches for this, okay? For instance, there are reports that provide very detailed aspects of a program, and there are others that simply focus on providing perhaps a summary. But the main point here is that the use of qualitative and quantitative performance measures is encouraged, and we have definitely seen more and more interest from investors in reporting practices. There are different initiatives supporting the reporting agenda. We have, for instance, the global reporting and disclosure framework, such as the Global Reporting Initiative, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. There is also CDP, SASB, which is a framework created in the United States, and which provides more sectorial guidance. There is also the United Nations Global Compact, that although they do not provide guidance on specific reporting metrics through what they call communication of process reports, they basically invite organizations to share non-financial information. There is also UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which has been working in the past years to find a common ground and harmonize the reporting market. And these initiatives are rather, all of these initiatives are rather tilted towards corporate reporting or corporate sustainability reporting, but they can definitely provide some guidance on reporting practices. And finally, there are some other organizations and initiatives such as IGMA, IRIS Plus, and the Nordic Position Paper, which provide more specific guidance on impact reporting, so that entities can report on the environmental results that have been made possible through the use of green bonds proceeds. Next slide, please. So great. This is the end of the second session. Ujala, how do you think we are in terms of time?
Yeah, I think it's looking good. Yeah, I think we can move into a Q&A session if you're good with that.
Good. Let me then take a quick look at the chat here. I see a question from Lucian, which asks about the difference between assurance of the bond and a second party opinion on the issuance of the bond. Well, yes, indeed, these are, as we mentioned before, some methodologies that exist in the market at the moment. You might recall that we mentioned before that second party opinions are, we could say, are the most popular form of external review at the moment in the green bond market, and this is perhaps the result of its flexibility. The main difference between this methodology and assurance is simply that both of them provide an opinion on the framework that is being used for the bond, but the second party opinion also provides an opinion of the issuer's overall sustainability narrative. So it takes also into consideration the sustainability and social aspects of the issuance, while assurance, we could say, it focuses more specifically on the green credentials of the issuance. I don't see any other question.
Abraham, I wonder if I can address some of the previous questions, and I think there's a couple others that I might have for you, if that's okay.
Definitely, yeah. Please go ahead,
Okay.
Jala.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just ask one more from you because we haven't had a chance to talk about this, but it'd be good to hear your thoughts on labeling of the bond. So, we're talking about resilience bonds here, but we're talking about them within the framework of a green bond. So what does that, should people be labeling their bonds as resilience bonds or as green bonds? What makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, as Sean correctly pointed out before, I think that everything that contributes to a sustainable development is very much welcome. It truly depends on the issuer's final decision to name it resilience or green bond or blue bond or social bond. It of course, when issuing a bond, issuers need to think in terms of the principles that they will be following, right? As we presented before, there are the green bond principles, which have, since they were launched, they have provided good guidance to the market. But IGMA has also produced, for instance, the social bond principles, right? So it really depends the main target of where the proceeds will be used. Are we talking about a project that it could be considered more green, or are we talking about a project that is more tilted towards social positive outcomes? Do we have a clear idea of the projects that we're going to be funding? Are these projects fully in line with the resilience concept? Then I believe it will make sense, to name it resilience or green bond. But I think that the overall purpose here, and that we shouldn't forget, is that the ultimate purpose of this is to contribute. All of these efforts contribute to a sustainable development, right?
Yeah, it needs to go to Sean. So, Jala, can you hear me?
I think you are on mute, Jala.
Yes, we hear you, Sean. Go for it. Sorry. Please picture.
I'm having wrestling the technicals here. Getting a picture of me going is proving challenging. But just on the pricing, look, at the end of the day, we don't really care if something is called a resilience, a green, a purple, or a motley pink bond. Let's be clear about that. We care about the money going to the right place. However, in this large and liquid market that we've managed to create, there are protocols which are seen as attractive. And that's the reporting, the transparency, the due diligence aspect. So if you can participate in that market, you get the benefits of that market. And that's what we've got to be conscious of when we issue. So if you go to issue a bond that's for resilience, you want to make sure it's part of that market. You're actually issuing a green bond or a sustainable bond, or you're calling it a green resilience bond. Make sure in your marketing it's tied to that larger that larger market, and you'll get the benefits of that larger market, including all the pricing issues that are beginning to appear in hard currencies. That's really the point. But when you go out initially, do you call it a resilience bond? Do you call it a green bond? This is about marketing. You can call it a resilience bond. We've seen it. The EBRD did it, as Craig Davies will talk about it. It can work, but it's part of the green bond market, and that's your subtext or your subtitle. That's the key thing. So it's like having your cake and eat it too. You can do both ways.
Great. Thanks, Sean. I think we have time for maybe one last question. Is that all right, Abraham? Could I ask?
Please go ahead, Jella.
Perfect, thank you. So Sean, this one I think perhaps you could field. This is, what advantage did the private companies get from the green bond issuance? What were the terms any different from those institutions borrowing in the local international capital markets? Were there concessions included, and from who? So this is specific. This question is specific to the bonds we've mentioned, but I'd like to hear just in general from you, if you could answer generally what kind of advantages the private companies do see.
So in most markets, where there is the benefit of deep shareholder, or I should say investor relations, it's a way of getting more investors, which may or may not, that's a treasurer call, have a benefit on the pricing issue. You know, when you look at the data of pricing benefit, for the first 10 years this market, we didn't see a lot. We saw people issuing a bond and getting a good price. And they got new investors, like 60% new investors to the book, or maybe as low as 20 sometimes. Now, it didn't show up in the pricing because no one issued, or very few people, issued a green bond on the same day they issued a vanilla bond. So you didn't have the comparative that you could do. And the differences are marginal. But you know, I remember David Raskino, who's currently the chief executive of the Indian Export-Import Bank in Mumbai, saying to me once, Sean, I got 17%, only 17% new investors. But you don't think I can't extract a better price out of 17%? Of course I can extract a better price. Of course I can, he said. It's not going to show up in the data, but I'm a treasurer. I know what I'm doing. What can I say? It doesn't show up in the data. If you're a treasurer, and if you know what you're doing, you will understand the benefits you can get by winning more investors. And that part of the equation has been there from day one. Increasing your order book, increasing the number of investors that sign up, and getting investors that are rusted on. I remember when KfW, the German Development Bank, did their first green bond. No price difference. They resisted doing a green bond for a couple of years. We're green anyway. We don't need a green bond. Everyone knows we're green. Eventually, they got convinced by the argument they might help kickstart a German green bond market. But after they issued, I can remember a conversation with Treasury where they said, you know, we got all these investors phoning us up and saying, love your green bond. Really interesting. Tell us more about it. And they would say, but you've been an investor with us for 20 years. You know we're green. No, but I really like the green bond. And what they found, it significantly increased the stickiness, as they called it, of their investors. That is, the investors who were sold and would come back easily the next time and so on. Now, these are gold dust for a treasurer with repeat issuance, and that applies everywhere. So you're not necessarily going to see a strict pricing difference up front, particularly in currencies where there's no liquidity and no secondary market trading. However, what we have seen in European and US dollar markets is price difference become the norm through secondary market trading. These have become value retention vehicles because whenever the market corrects and bond prices fall through the floor, green bond prices stay up, they hold. And that is gold dust because bond investors are first and foremost defensive. They don't want to lose their money. That's the most important thing because they've got to they've got assets and liabilities matching responsibilities. And that has been leading to significant improved secondary market pricing, which is giving primary market benefit. But you need liquidity. You haven't got liquidity, you're not going to see that because there isn't the data floating around. No, the green bonds in places like Africa have not been issued with special concessionary finance or with incentives. They haven't anyway. And the issuers have been pretty damn happy. I've yet to meet a treasurer in the world who didn't resist green bond issuance in advance until the CEO said do it, but it didn't become a fan afterwards because of the reaction of their investors. There's one market where we have seen incentives, and that's the Chinese market. And that has been an important part of the story. It's hard to differentiate whether it would have grown anyway, but it's not so much an investor-driven market, it's a regulator-driven market. And there, if you post green bonds as a bank at the liquidity lending window of the central bank, you'll get a 1% discount on funds. Pretty cool incentive. So it works in a particular kind of market where the dominant thing is regulation driving change. It would work in Nigeria or Kenya if they had the wherewithal, there's funds available to be able to support it. And we are encouraging development banks in richer countries to provide some form of either contingency finance or guarantee schemes to deliver a slightly lower cost of capital for green. But it's not what's driven the market so far. That's the interesting part of it. This will turbocharge it rather than start it. Remember, if you're a repeat issuer, it's all about resilience.
Just wanted to pick up on that point. No, I wanted to pick up on that point because you just answered a question that a lot of people have been asking, I think, about what are the kind of incentives and actions that we can take. And that's, I think, the concessionary capital, blended finance, these kind of approaches are something that in emerging markets are going to be really critical for getting more issuance because of these barriers that you mentioned. So sorry to cut you there, Sean. Just wanted to...
It's all right. I was going on, Ajala. It's fine.
No. We love to hear from you. So much information always. But I think we'd like to move into Craig's experience and listening to him speak about his issuance on EBRD's bond. But thank you. Abraham.
Yes, thank you very much, Sean and Ujala. It's always a pleasure to hear all your thoughts. Please, colleagues, if there are any other questions, please do not hesitate to continue sharing them with us through the chat box. And if time allows, towards the end of the session, we could try to address them. So next, as my colleague Ujala already mentioned, and we mentioned also at the beginning of the session, we have a very special guest speaker today here with us, Craig Davis, who holds a PhD in environmental technology from Imperial College London, and who is the Associate Director of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And he is here today to share with all of us his real life experience in the resilience bonds agenda. So Craig, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Abraham. Can I start by checking that you can hear me and see me well?
We can see you and we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Okay, well, thanks to Abraham, thanks to Ujala and Sean and the entire CBI team, not only for the invitation to speak today, it's a real honor to be able to contribute to this really interesting session, but also for all the collaboration that's gone on leading up to this, which has also been a very exciting experience for us, and which has really helped us to break some new ground together in some very interesting and promising ways. So I'd like to just take a few minutes. I'll try not to be too long-winded. I'll try to be quite concise and to leave as much time as possible for questions and answers. Maybe just next slide, please. A few little bits of information about the EBRD in case you don't know who we are, but we are one of the multilateral development banks. We operate in a very interesting region, which you can see on this map, which is a very varied region, ranging from Europe down into Northern Africa and across well into Central Asia and even beyond to Mongolia. Very interesting region, a mix of mainly middle income and some low income countries. A very interesting region in terms of climate. On the mitigation side, some of the most carbon intensive economies in the world, but also some of the world's most climate vulnerable countries, particularly in terms of, for example, extreme and increasing water stress in places like North Africa and the Middle East, and also very rapid hydrological change in the glacial regions of Central Asia. So we have a lot of countries where climate change really matters, both in terms of their decarbonisation pathway and their climate vulnerabilities. Just also to add that we are an MDB, but we are a very in a sense, a strongly private sector focused MDB. We operate on commercial terms. We lend at market rates. We don't offer concessional financing from our own resources. So we're very much tuned into working with markets and working with the private sector, and very importantly to crowding in private finance, which is why bonds and green bonds are such exciting instruments for us. Maybe on the next slide, please. I'd like to say, paint a little bit of a green picture of why green matters so much to EBRD. As I've mentioned, our region climate is such an important issue for us in our region, as indeed it is for all the MDBs globally now. We've been focusing on financing green investments since, we started counting in 2006. And since then, we've committed more than 40 billion euros of investment for green investments. That's increasing, the momentum is building, and we're finding that amount of green financing is growing. So of the 40 billion, 3.2 billion of those were committed last year during 2020, which is around 40% of our total lending. And last year we committed to becoming a majority green bank. So in other words, by 2025, more than half of what we do, half of our investment volume will be green finance. Now, and also going even further than that, we've also committed this year, along with all the other MDBs, to aligning all of our operations with the Paris Agreement. So in other words, all of our financing will be aligned with low carbon and climate resilient development pathways. So green is hugely important to us. And within green, we make sure that we don't forget climate resilience. It is the forgotten little brother or sister or nephew, or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't get the attention it deserves. If you look at the reality of climate change, yes, we must urgently decarbonize our economy. It's the imperative of our generation, but we have to do that in a way that addresses the reality of a changing and more variable climate. So we all know intuitively that over the coming years and decades, but years, because we can't wait for the decades, we are going to really have to ramp up what we're doing on climate resilience financing. And that's why for us at EBRD, climate resilience financing is a big part of what we do on green. It's an integral part of what we do on green. You can see the numbers on the slide. We've financed more than 320 climate resilience investments since we started counting in 2011, with a total investment volume of more than 9 billion. And within that, dedicated adaptation finance amounting to 2.6 billion euros. So climate resilience adaptation financing is a big part of what we call green financing. Lastly, on green bonds, we're very active in the green bonds market. We've been issuing green bonds since 2010, and our cumulative green bond issuances now exceed 7 billion euros. And we're also very actively involved in various market development and standard setting activities in the green bond market. Not only our excellent collaboration with CBI, but also, for example, a very deep engagement with the green bond principles that have been established by ICMA and other partners. So we're very active in all of those areas. So looking at this slide, it's not difficult to see that when we were approached by the CBI 3 years ago, to work with them on a very interesting piece of work they were commissioning on developing principles for climate resilience in bonds, we jumped at the chance. Because to us, it was such a great opportunity to think together with leading experts from CBI and elsewhere, how can we harness the potential of the green bond market to finance climate resilience? We know that the adaptation financing needs are enormous. We know that they cannot possibly be met by government expenditure or aid budgets alone. We know that we've got to crowd in private finance and mobilize private finance. So the chance to look at ways of harnessing the power of the green bond market for precisely that purpose was extremely exciting, especially now that there's such a lot of focus on the climate finance mobilization agenda. For example, as we head towards COP26 next month, many of our shareholders are really asking us to look very closely at how the MDBs can mobilize more private finance for climate action, including adaptation. So again, this all adds emphasis to the need and the potential for using green bonds as an important financing instrument for adaptation. So just to cut to the chase a little bit, when we worked with CBI on the climate resilience principles, which Ujala has already shown you, when that report came out in 2019, we thought this is a great piece of work, let's use it. And so in consultation with CBI and others, we decided to use the climate resilience principles to structure a new kind of green bond issuance. If on the next slide, please, I'll be able to show you some details of the inaugural climate resilience bond issuance that we made in September 2019. So I'll go into a bit more detail in the next few slides as to how we structured this issuance. But in other words, in brief, we went to the bond markets with originally an issuance of 500 million US dollars. What we did is we based this on our portfolio of climate resilience investments, because we've been tracking climate resilience in our operations for a long time, since about 2010. So we've got a lot of information about the physical climate risks. And also we've done a lot of work in many investments to actually build in resilience by designing the projects better infrastructure, more climate resilient infrastructure, helping our businesses, our clients to manage physical climate risks to their operations in various sectors. So we've got a lot of information in our portfolio that we were able to draw from reasonably quickly and efficiently to put together a climate resilience bond issuance. The bond was oversubscribed, so we went to the market to raise $500 million, and we ended up raising $700 million. So it was oversubscribed. Now, there was a really interesting question earlier about pricing and the famous greenium. Now, I can't go into that in much depth, and I know one of the questions that Ujala has asked me to think about here is, was there a pricing differential? I can't really answer that question. What I can tell you is that the bond issuance was oversubscribed substantially. What I can tell you is that there was great interest from investors in the climate resilient bond issuance, and we had quite a number of very interesting discussions with some of the investors, before they were thinking of coming into the issuance, thinking of participating, and they really wanted to know about, how are you understanding these physical climate risks? What are you doing about these physical climate risks? How do you measure the impact that your investment is having in building climate resilience? So there was very strong interest. We did end up tightening the pricing a little bit. Maybe it was marginal, a little bit, in response to the oversubscription. So was the oversubscription because it was climate resilience? Was the oversubscription because it was EBRD with our good credit rating and all the rest? I can't answer that question. There's only one data point. So I don't think you can really draw this conclusion from that one data point. But certainly there was very strong interest from investors in this bond issuance, and there has continued to be as we have tapped the issuance further. And you can see from the diagram there that we had a good mix of investors coming in, a sort of rough 3 or 4 way split between asset managers. A lot of central banks and official institutions came in, but also insurance, pensions, and then commercial banks as well. So we had a pretty good spread of investors and different types of investors coming in to the issuance. And you can see reasonably good geographical distribution as well, with maybe a bias towards European investors. On the next slide, please, I'll just say a little bit about where the proceeds went. Now, Ujala was making some very interesting points earlier about the geographical bias that we see in the very interesting analysis that CBI have done together with the Global Centre on Adaptation on where our climate resilience bond issuance is happening. And Ujala is right, and the evidence shows that it's happening mainly in developed markets. And that, in a sense, is it's good that it's happening there, but what we'd really like to see is more of this activity in the more vulnerable countries, which tend to be the lower income countries in the developing world. But what we can see from our results here is that because of our region, we did indeed have a lot of the investments that went into this bond issuance coming from emerging markets, maybe not low-income countries, because we don't operate in many low-income countries, but you can see some middle-income countries, some quite highly climate vulnerable middle-income countries like Morocco, like Turkey, for example, coming through quite strongly in terms of the geographical mix of the use of proceeds. In terms of sector, very interesting, there was a strong bias towards infrastructure. And that is, I think, quite telling in its own right, partly because the majority of what we do on our climate resilience investment is climate resilient infrastructure. So maybe not surprising that we saw the lion's share of the financing going towards infrastructure investments. But also, I think it's also fair to say that in many of the countries where we're investing, more climate resilient infrastructure is a priority, and it is a priority for those countries and their climate resilient development, and it is a priority in many of the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and the national adaptation plans of those countries. So interesting to see that infrastructure bias in the bond issuance. On the next slide, I'll maybe give a little bit more of a backstory to the way that we prepared this issuance. So could we have the next slide, please? So as I said earlier, thank you. What we did is that we looked at our portfolio of climate resilience investments. Now, let me just take a little minute to talk about that. We have been collecting information on our climate resilience investment operations for a long time. We've been screening and tracking our investments for exposure to physical climate risk. We've then been zooming in on the projects where we identify these greater exposure to physical climate risk, and we've been, where we can, doing something about those physical climate risks by, for example, building infrastructure differently, by building it in a way that's more resilient, by using climate change projections and making decisions, helping our clients to make decisions about how they build and maintain their infrastructure, or using better climate information, including climate change projections, to advise the businesses who are our clients on how they can be running their businesses in a way that enables them to manage physical climate risk, whether it be increasing water stress or increasing flood risk. So we've got a lot of information in our portfolio, and we were able to extract that information, which we'd been tracking for other purposes, like reporting to our shareholders on how much adaptation finance we were providing. But it was very useful because we could then go through our portfolio and pick the projects that we felt were the ones that were most eligible and most fitting for a climate resilience bond issuance. Now, you might say, oh, well, that's all well and good because you're an MDB and you've been collecting this kind of information for 10 years, but other financial institutions can't do that. There's some truth in that, but I think the direction of travel now, particularly that we're all now operating in this environment and context of climate-related financial disclosures, which include physical climate-related disclosures, the direction of travel of financial markets in general, both financial institutions, banks, other types of investors, but also financial supervisors, is in the direction of much more attention on the disclosure of physical climate risks, and also the disclosure and the identification of corresponding opportunities. So I think, yes, MBBs might be a bit unusual in that we've been collecting this kind of information for longer, but I think everybody's moving in that direction. And I think that's an important point to make in setting out the potential for bonds as an instrument for climate resilience financing, that the increased disclosure of this kind of information is going to make it, I think, more possible for other sorts of financial institutions and other entities like sovereigns and sub-sovereigns to collect the kind of information they need to structure issuances like these. And just very briefly from the slide, you can see that we then structured this issuance. We kind of grouped the projects together into different sorts of categories to make them more understandable to investors and to give investors a better picture, a better handle on the sorts of things that were included there. And secondly, or lastly, we also then very explicitly and very transparently put this information out there in the public domain. So, we very clearly set out in a framework for climate resilience, for our climate resilience bonds, that these were based on the CBI climate resilience principles, for example. And we very explicitly set out for investors, anybody could read it in the public domain, how we were structuring this transaction. Reporting, because I think some interesting comments were made earlier about reporting. On the next slide, please. Well, we report annually through our sustainability reports, which you can see on the EBRD website. Again, it's fully in the public domain. And we have a whole section in that report every year on our green bonds. So that, in a way, is the mechanism that we use for reporting both to our investors and, in fact, to anybody who wants to know about what's happening with our green bonds, including, as Abraham mentioned, the earmarking idea and just confirming and verifying that the use of proceeds is still for the purposes that were declared at the point of making the issuance. But we've gone one step further with our climate resilience reporting. I'm sorry that the font is really small. It does look bigger if you zoom in. And perhaps you can see that this is the template that we use for reporting on the expected results of our climate resilience financing, of our climate resilience bond portfolio. And for example, it sets out indications of the amount of capital, amount of finance within those bonds that we're allocating to projects that address different types of physical climate risks. So increasing extreme weather events, for example, or increasing heat stress, as you can see. And we're then giving information on how much of the finance in our climate resilience bond portfolio is allocated to projects that are doing something about those risks. And then down the left-hand side, you can see we've got different, what we call climate resilience outcomes. These are the expected outcomes of our projects in terms of how they're contributing to climate resilience. And so they include things like, for example, increased water availability or reduced weather-related damage or reduced weather-related disruption. So we see this as being an extra instrument for communicating to our investors and indeed to others on what the investments in that bond portfolio, in that issuance, what they're contributing in terms of building climate resilience. So this is early days for climate resilient results reporting, but we are finding from investors that investors, they want results. They want to know that it's all very well to say that something is a climate resilient investment, but they want to see something that gives them more evidence that actually the investment is really doing something about climate resilience in a concrete sense. So this is a step maybe in the conversation around how to report to investors on the results of climate resilience investments. Lastly, and the last slide, please. Lessons learned. Well, I mean, we have certainly been very pleased that we've been able to take this step. Could we have the last slide, please? Thanks. So the issuance, as I said, there was an inaugural issuance September 2019, which ended up being for $700 million. We've tapped that issuance several times since then. So the current total principal outstanding is now $1.15 billion US. So the issuance has grown. It's certainly on the positive side been a very important step for us in terms of broadening our climate resilience agenda. We've been very pleased to be able, and in partnership with CBI and others, to start making the link between climate resilience and capital markets, and to start articulating, how important we believe it is for capital markets to be part of the solution to providing the large amounts of finance that we know is needed for investing in climate resilience in countries around the world. Broadening our investor base, exploring these new engagement opportunities. I mean, we had new investors coming in, wanting to know about our climate resilient bond activities. And I think also, lastly, on the positive side, again, making quite an important contribution to this debate about private finance mobilization for adaptation. It's kind of the holy grail about, if you've worked on adaptation, I have for nearly 12, 13 years, the holy grail has always been, how can we crowd in private finance for adaptation? How can we do it? We've been talking about it for a decade. And I think at last, with green bonds for climate resilience or climate resilience bonds, we actually have something on the table that really has potential for providing that holy grail. Just one last point, maybe on the sort of not so positive side. The big difficulty is generating the deals, and the big difficulty is and that is the really hard part. And we had 10 years to put the portfolio together, and what we find is that after that first issuance, it's been slower to then generate the new deals that are eligible as climate resilience investments. And I think that is the big bottleneck, and it's difficult for us as an MDB. Lots of support will be needed for other entities that may wish to access bond markets to finance their climate resilience needs. Lots of support on project origination, lots of support on going through their portfolios and identifying the things in their portfolios or in their pipelines that could be eligible. So it's that pipeline generation where a lot of support and work is needed. So I'll pause there because I probably am over time, and I said I'd be concise, but I'm happy to take any Q&A that there may be time for.
Thank you very much, Craig. We truly appreciate the time that you invested to be here with us, and we sincerely thank you for sharing with all of us your experience with resilience bonds. I think it was very valuable for the audience to hear more about an institution that has been directly involved in this agenda, and of course to listen to the real benefits of issuing this format, and of course the challenges that they might encounter in the process. I'm not sure if we're gonna have time for Q&A because we need to wrap up, because there's another session coming up in 1 minute. So perhaps if you have any questions for
Ladies and gentlemen,
Technical difficulties there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I
Yes.
can hear you. Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, I think that we were cut off, right?
Yes, it gets automatically cut.
Oh,
But it was
okay.
great, guys. Good job. Well done.
Well, we managed to cover.
Craig, you're on mute.
You're on mute.